So the first part in setting up a custom downpipe is, of course, the measuring. There's a lot of measuring that goes into this. And so we've got the manifold firmly on where it's going to be. And what I've done is I've just put this little straight edge across exactly where the end of the turbo will be, the exhaust output side. And I've measured it. It's exactly 4 1/8 away from the center of this stud right here. And I measured from this side just because it's a little bit easier to measure out that distance as opposed to some small amount of distance on the measuring tape and so on. So this is perpendicular. I can measure that out. And what we're going to be doing, I've left this in place as well. You can see the socket for the, the flange for the exhaust mid pipe is down there. We're going to be cutting that off, so it's not going to be at the same angle. And I'm probably just going to have a straight pipe going through where that flange used to be, and then having the flange a little bit further down at more of a perpendicular angle to the car. And then we're going to make everything match up. So this is what I'm going to be using for the start of the downpipe. We have a flange that's going to go onto the turbo right here, and then we've got this 90-degree, and it's more than just a 90-degree, it's a tight radius 90-degree. So this is a 3-inch pipe. You can tell this is pretty thick. Now the radius of this curve is very important. You want to look for something, if you're going to do it this way, a tight radius. Usually they'll give the radius in inches as well. So this is also a 3-inch radius. So that's about as tight as you can possibly make a 3-inch pipe is a 3-inch radius. You can get less of a radius, 4 inches, 4.5 inches, 5 inches, and that's a more gradual bend to 90. But this is basically as tight as you can get. So let's see what this is going to look like. Basically, we've got this in here. And if I just put it up against the shelf, we want to leave some clearance, but if I just put it all the way back, you can see where it kind of cuts off. That's the plane of which it needs to be cut off. So not very much. Basically, right after the curve, that's where we're going to cut this pipe. And so you can see kind of from above what it looks like, and not a lot of room there. And so we're going to shoot it down at a slight angle. I don't know if you can tell from the angle that I have it, but this would be straight up and down, whereas we're going to be putting it this way to avoid the column. I want to give that a little bit of space, at least 1.5 inches, 2 inches. And then there's going to be another bend that has to come in from beneath it to route it down at about a 45, and then to under the car. Alright, so here's the flange that I ended up getting, and it's just a mild steel 5-bolt flange, and just got it on eBay, and it basically worked, except that I had to hollow this out a little bit. So this is a little bit of an issue, how thin this is. It's not, it's kind of thin right here anyway. This is how it would normally be. But as this bolts on, if you look at it from this side, the mating surface side, yeah, that's a little thin. So there might be an issue with some leakage there for that side. So we'll have to see how that goes. Otherwise, if I need to get a different flange, I can do that and just cut it off and remake this thing. But so what this comes with is a little inset portion. And so this is actually 3 inches around. And I have a 3-inch exhaust pipe. But as you can see, it's sort of more of an oval shape, and so what is going to happen is this part I'm going to put in my press and bend this into more of an oval. So it's always good to test what you're going to do before you actually do it on your real piece. So I have this 90 right here that's the real 90-degree tight radius thing that I'm going to use for my down out of the flange. And I just cut off a piece of this, also 3-inch exhaust piping that was a little mangled anyway, so I wasn't really going to use that stretch of pipe. So I just cut off some to kind of play with it. And so I used my press and also decent sized vise, kind of medium vise. It's a 5-inch vise, and kind of press this into shape. It goes pretty quickly to get the basic oval, but what's going to happen is you're going to find that the top and the bottom here, as shown, are going to be a little bit too pointy. So you want to go the other way. So a normal bend is like this, and then you're going to want to put it like this and kind of massage it slowly into place. All right, so let's see where we are now. So originally we had this, and it's a nice oval shape. However, that's not how it's going to be in the car. If we look at a 90 here, we've got our 90. The oval is not completely straight up and down in the car, and so what happens is the actual oval needs to be offset by a bit, and it's offset from the center line of the pipe. So this needs to kind of go like this to avoid the steering column, but it can't go too far because of the transmission bell housing in the block is right there. So it has to be just right. So as it turns out, cutting this very close in starting with this kind of plane, like a straight perpendicular to the center line plane, means that this has to be cut rather close. And what happens is, from a metal perspective, this interior curve is actually way stiffer than the outside curve. And so what happens is, when you're trying to put an oval that's now at this line, it doesn't like to crush in the same way as this pipe does. So that became a bit of a challenge to get it to look right. And so the second attempt was basically this. This is my test, and then we did this. And this has gone through some iterations, but this is how it's looking right now. This is at about the right angle, but yeah, it's pretty rough. This thing is really beat up at this point and mangled, and I want to make something a little cleaner, because the plane of this is not very flat, and it will require a lot of filling, and you can't really grind it, because of course the way this is oriented, there's actually a screw right here, and if it gets much shorter right across this dimension, then that screw, you will not be able to screw in the bottom stud for the flange. So instead of cutting it off kind of straight in a plane that looks like this, what I did, which gives me more room, is I kind of rotated it, and now I'm going to cut it in a plane like this. Now what that does is this turns into an oval in and of itself. So our same technique for crushing it with the press and everything is not going to quite work, but it'll free up some extra room as it curves down. Now it makes this bottom part more complicated because now it has to curve back towards the rest of the exhaust pipe, but at least this makes the oval a little more straightforward. So let's see what we come up with. Alright, so we got attempt number 3, and it is a little bit kind of mangly looking, but this is actually not too bad. As you can see, the oval is pretty smooth. This is by design. I bent this inward to make kind of a flow around one of the studs, so that it'd be easier to deal with, and there's enough space right here to make sure that this would clear the bottom stud. And so this isn't perfect, but it is pretty flat, and so we'll be able to grind this down just a tad right here, take off a little material right there to make it more flat, and then there won't be much filling. There's actually a little bit of gap here, which I think I can massage out. If not, I can put a little plate right there as well to fill that in. But this is looking quite a bit better, and as you can see, the offset is not nearly as much as what was required from that straight thing, and the reason for that has to do with because of how it's angling sort of back like this. When this is straight up and down, you can see this, instead of dropping straight down, it kind of angles this way, and so that's the reason why I could get less of an offset. So that kind of made everything a lot easier by having less of an offset with this. So since this is taking a bit longer than anticipated, We're going to talk about a few odds and ends that we really need to consider before our first start. And so I'll get those out of the way in this episode so that I can get this video out for you guys. So join me over here at the quick chat cam. Hey kids, come on, come over here. Let's have a quick chit chat. Hey, I know you've been going through changes and there's some things that we need to discuss. I know you feel invulnerable, but there's some dangers out there you need to be aware of. And I know the changes that you're experiencing in your power levels can be scary, but it's okay. If we take the right precautions, you can be safe out there and have a great time. So what I'm talking about, of course, is your PCV, positive crankcase ventilation system. And a lot of people have a lot of confusion over the system. They think it's purely for emissions purposes, that it doesn't even need to be there. You can delete it. That is not the case. It is, the way it's set up can be partially for emissions reasons, but the real reason for it is to prevent damage to your engine over time. And so we're going to talk about the different aspects and what you need to do. It's pretty cheap aspect as far as the whole build is concerned. These are pretty inexpensive items, but we're going to talk about your PCV valve and what to get when you go forced induction and other little odds and ends that you also need to get. So let's take a look at what the actual engine is doing and why it's doing it. All right, so looking at the engine bay from the front, we've got obviously our intake, throttle body, intake manifold. And you'll see a bunch of vacuum hoses and everything. As the engine is running, it's pulling air in. This pulling of air causes a vacuum to occur in here. And these vacuum hoses are routed to various sensors and whatnot to control the engine. And you have this as well, this pipe. And it may look different on different cars. It may come out to the side or whatever. But this is your PCV hose. And it goes over here to your valve cover where your PCV valve is located. So your valve cover sits on top of the valves and the camshafts, and it has oil passageways that pump oil up to those rotating bits, and also oil drains that drain it back down in through the crankcase and all that. So this oil is constantly circulating. Now, why is that important? Well, in any running engine, and this can be a brand new engine as well, you're going to have a little bit of what's called blow-by. And so this is extra gases that escape past the rings of your piston. And as the piston compresses and it explodes for the power stroke, a little bit of those gases are going to escape past the rings, and basically that vapor is going to end up in the crankcase, which ends up circulating around in exactly the same way as the oil. And so this vapor is partially consists of unburnt fuel, oil, mist, all that kind of stuff. And basically what this does is, and that carbon, what this does is contaminate the oil. So we want to get that out of there as much as possible. This is why your oil turns black. In an engine that didn't have any blow-by whatsoever, your oil would never turn black. But that's what's happening, is the carbon and other contaminants from the blow-by is getting back into the oil, and it turns the oil black. That's why when you drain like your transmission or something, there's no combustion near it, and so there shouldn't be. And that's why that comes out relatively clear if you have a working transmission. So since the beginning of internal combustion engines, we knew that that stuff is bad and it's better to get it out of there. And so in the old days, they simply had a hose that would connect to the crankcase, and in this case the valve covers, internally connected all the way to the crankcase and everything like that. And this hose would simply just go down underneath the car, and stuff would just sort of drip out. And when you were driving, there would be kind of a suction effect because of the movement of air past the end of the hose, and that would help draw out even more. And so what this did was it caused there to be a lot of oil spilled all over the world, all over the street. Every time you parked, there was always an oil spot. And that's the emissions part of it. Instead of letting it just drain out of the car, we end up connecting it to our intake manifold. Now, the reason we connect this is not just for emissions. Now, it is helpful for emissions because now this mist comes back into the intake and it gets resucked into the engine and burned off. That little bit of, extra energy doesn't really affect too much the combustion process, and it's not going to, cause any kind of problems. It's not going to cause any major richness in the air-fuel mixture. But what's really important about drawing that blow-by mist into the intake manifold is that this is a source of vacuum, and it can scavenge those gases much more readily than being just exposed to ambient air. And so that's why it's not a good idea to delete this, because then it's not actually getting sucked out very well, and your ventilation system is not terribly effective. And if you were to just plug this up, that would be very bad, because now you're pressurizing your crankcase, and you're going to be, it's basically going to have to blow out somehow. That may be something innocuous like blowing out your dipstick. That's usually where the pressure can escape. But it also could be something much worse, which could be various seals, cam seals, the gasket, and then your piston rings itself take a beating from that. Now, at the same time, you don't really want this to be under vacuum. It works best when it's at a regular, kind of pressure. So you want to suck the mist out, but you also want to have a source of air for it to come in. That's where this breather line comes in. Now, on the stock Miata, this breather line connects around and it comes down to the crossover tube that's right here. So when this is sucking in air, it's sucking in metered air. So your MAF or AFM is right here, and it's going to meter the air, and then as anything gets sucked in to your valve cover, that's going to be metered air, so it's not introducing anything that's not accounted for by the ECU. So the mist comes out, fresh air comes in to replace it, and it's a kind of a continuous cycle. Now, you have a valve that's right here. At certain times, you do not want this valve to be open. And a misnomer is that the valve is actually just a pure check valve. And in a way that's true, but also like a normal check valve has two states. It's either open in one direction and closed in the other direction, and then that's it. Most PCV valves have really three states. It's closed a certain amount of time, and then it becomes open in one direction, but after a certain pressure level, and then it's always closed the opposite direction. So this is the valve from a Mazda 323 GTX, and it is built for forced induction, and we'll get to why that is that we'd like to switch to that. But basically, you have a system where it's got a little, some of them have springs, but this has like basically a little ball bearing, and you can hear it rattle. And if you blow on it in this direction, so it sits like this in the valve cover. So if you try to push air into the valve cover, it stops it. It closes. You will not be able to blow this direction. However, if you suck the opposite direction, so draw air out of the valve cover and in towards the intake manifold, then it will draw air out. However, if you do this very carefully, you can do this test yourself. Especially in this orientation, you'll notice that the weight of the ball bearing holds it closed. What that means is that under very little pressures, it will not open immediately. It will open after the pressure reaches a cracking point, basically, and it opens up that little ball bearing and it starts drawing things out. This is what you want, because you don't really need it to scavenge under idle conditions. What you want it to do is basically do a little scavenging at cruise conditions, and you actually want it to close, not scavenge under wide open throttle conditions. All right, so why do we want to replace the stock one? Well, the stock one is not meant for boost. So it's always going to experience either vacuum or at most regular ambient pressures, which is basically wide open throttle. And in those cases, it'll work just fine. However, when we've put extra PSI in here for boost, it's going to leak. And that's a problem because it'll start pressurizing your crankcase. We don't want that. So that's why this type of valve from a turbo car is better. Now, the problem with this, and a lot of people just stick with this without realizing that this has a max level of boost that it can take. The stock 323s only went to about 8 psi, and this can be a problem if you're going well over 8 psi, which is often the case in the Miata community. Even a small turbo can go to 10, 12, 14 psi without much difficulty. So, and that's what a lot of people do. So you need something extra to protect it. And that's where this guy comes in. So this is a true check valve. It'll be open in one direction and it'll be completely closed in the other direction, and it will hold up to 150 psi. So what we do is we put this in line with our hose, and that gives full protection to our crankcase. Now the question also comes up, what about catch cans? What are they? So a catch can is something that can help also remove that oily gaseous vapor in such a way that it doesn't have any effect. You don't want that mess necessarily to go into your intake either. It doesn't really change your AFRs that much, but if you're pushing the limit, it can be an issue, and it can also kind of gum up things in here. This gets carbonized rather quickly. You may need to clean it out. It's really not that bad, but in a Miata especially, but a catch can prevent all that. And so what happens is you would take this hose, route it to a can that has some baffling material in it, and so the gases come in, go into that can, get routed down and around and cool off in the process and become liquid, settle in the bottom of the can, and then the air itself, which has now been sort of cleaned, comes back around and gets drawn into the intake manifold as before. So what happens on the breather side of our system? Now, we need this to be open. Now, in our case, we have our own ECU that uses a MAP gauge, a pressure gauge, and so we don't care about meter to air. So what a lot of people do is they simply run a small air filter that's sized correctly. Always get air filters. Everything else is just a copy. But this goes on here like this, and that's basically fine. The problem with this is that potentially a little bit of suction on this side as well can help at wide open throttle position. So when you're at wide open throttle, you're getting maximum boost. You're getting zero scavenging from this side. However, it might be good to get a little bit of scavenging, for the motor's safety from this side. And a better way of really hooking this up is to run this tube to here, your intake. And so what happens is it will get air as needed. As the pressure falls in your valve cover, it's going to draw in air. This is not pressurized because it's before the turbo, so it's just ambient. But because you can stick a little pipe into this flow and angle it in such a way that through Bernoulli's principle, the air rushing past it will cause sort of a low pressure situation to occur. So in that one situation where you're at wide open throttle, there's no suction over here. In fact, there's boost. So that means this is closed and you're getting pressures over here. What this can do is it can actually suck air out and it can come into here. Now, of course, this has the same general issue. If you're sucking that nastiness out and it's going straight into your turbo, then you're getting a bunch of nastiness into your turbo. Now, how much that is, It may depend on sort of the age of your engine, the health of your seal, your piston rings, and so on. In most cases, it's not a huge amount, but this can also be a problem, and that's why a lot of people also run a catch can on this side as well. I don't really recommend hooking them up in a loop, circling it to have one catch can. It's better to have the system work the way it was originally designed, and so a 2 catch can process for that, I think, works better. All right, there you go. Not terribly noticeable, just kind of sits there. Now what will happen is, potentially into those circumstances, this will start to fill up with oil. And if you see that happening, if this starts getting soaked and then you see some drippage down here, and you'll also get some smoking because that oil is just going to drip right there on the manifold, then that's the time when you want to add a catch can for sure. If you don't really see that happening, then you're probably good. You really don't need to run a catch can. But this is common under a little bit more harder use situations like track use and so on. The other thing that can happen is oil will slosh around based on the G-forces applied to the car. So if you're making hard turns one way or the other, you could see a quick surge of oil wanting to leave either side of these holes. And so if you start getting that, then a catch can is also a good idea. There are baffles on the inside of the valve cover to prevent that exact situation, but the baffling is not super awesome, and it potentially can be enhanced. So, your mileage may vary for that, but that's something that can be done down the road as you get more experience with, driving your new turbo car in the style in which you're going to be using it. And finally, so we can see the flange on here. Got this cut out for there's a stud which normally goes right there, which I've removed just to make it easier to kind of see it and position it. But basically that's where the downpipe is going to go, and it's more or less in position. So what I'm going to do is, in the next video, we're going to get some actual welding going. And so I'm going to tack this up, make sure that it is set up correctly, and we've got enough clearance. I think we do. You see that line right there for that coolant that passes under the manifold. We bent that back, and so it's got just enough room. I think with some heat protection it'll be fine. This hose normally ran right next to the heat shielding and all in the stock car, so a lot of the heat is going to be more concentrated in this direction. It gets hit by the turbo itself. So with some additional shielding on here, I think we'll be good, and then we'll be able to get the rest of the downpipe mated up with the midpipe. All right, everybody, I'm going to wrap the video here. If you were to ask me, would I do this again? The answer is probably yes, but maybe not as a resounding yes as it would have been before. This part is definitely taking the longest of any of the rest of the build, and it's mostly just due to my inexperience for metal fabrication. So if you're really going this route, fully DIY, then keep in mind that it's going to take some trial and error. You may spend a fair amount of money on materials just because things mess up or whatever. So far, I haven't really spent that much, so it's been okay. Hopefully this all works and my welding skills will be up to the task. So we will see how that goes. But your other options are some pre-made downpipes from various people that can work with this style of Garrett turbo and the 5-bolt pattern. That's really been the worst part of it. That 5-bolt pattern is a killer. The way that it's oriented on the Miata, being mostly up and down but not quite, that's definitely been the Achilles heel. So anyway, thanks for watching. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Click to subscribe if you haven't already to be alerted to all the new videos in the series, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.